Thomas Becket was one of the most powerful figures of his time, serving as Royal Chancellor and later as Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1100s. After his assassination, he became Patron Saint of London, all of the way up until 1532 with the dissolution of the Monasteries by Henry VIII. To tell us more about the man, the myth, and also the Becket Pageant for London is James Winterbotham, historical consultant to the Becket Pageant for London. Hi James, a very warm welcome. I think it's worth starting with how this Becket Pageant for London came about.
The background is that I think in about 2018, Becket 2020 was set up, and that was going to celebrate his 900th birth, 850th anniversary of his martyrdom, and 800th anniversary of his translation to this Canterbury shrine nationally. So it was all organised by York University. And London thought they should do something particular because Becket was born in London, and he styled himself throughout his career Thomas of London. And after his martyrdom, he was adopted as the patron saint. So he became a very, central figure in medieval London's view of itself. And it just so happens that in 1519, there are records in the account books of the Skinners Company of a pageant that was laid on for Becket for the 400th anniversary of his birth. The 1519 pageant was part of what's called the Midsummer Watch, which was an annual summer, originally a show of force by the city, marching through the city from west to east and back. Over time, it became a great sort of midsummer celebration. So you had all sorts of entertainments. And you also had pageants, which we think in those days were largely floats with tableau vivant scenes, which weren't necessarily scripted, but they were scenes that were acted. And so in the case of the 1519 pageant, what you have is a bill for someone who played the jailer of Gilbert Becket, who was Thomas's father, someone who played the Sultan, and then various other people. And then you go back to the myth of Becket. A lot of it was around Becket's ancestry. So Becket's father was Gilbert Becket, was a London merchant. He became sheriff, and he had a house just opposite Tesco on Cheapside, and that's where Becket was born in 1120. And Becket's father had supposedly been on crusade. And on crusade, the Sultan's daughter had fallen in love with him, enabled his escape by giving his servant the keys to the prison. And then he came back to London, and she followed him. So this is the myth that Thomas's mother wasn't just an ordinary Norman lady. She was the daughter of a sultan from, Arabia. So this gave Thomas a lot more stature. These were all elements that must have gone into the 1519 pageant. And I think the other thing that was important about the 1519 pageant is that it was a huge community. All the guildsmen from the livery companies were involved. They had choir boys from the local school, from St. Paul's choir school, involved. And clearly bits and pieces came together from different parts of the community. The costumes are being made by a group of sewers from all over the city. Some are workers, some are residents, and they've all been organized by this fantastic costume maker, Sasha Kier, in her professional studio. There are giant puppets, one of which has been made by consulting with the community as to, what should the spirit of London look like as a puppet. And they're making this 15-foot tall puppet, which will appear in the parade. And there are schoolboys from St. Paul's Cathedral School singing in the show, as well as from other local schools. And there are, as well as a corps of professional actors, there are about 30 actors from the community, some of whom have hardly acted before. And they've all been brought together. This has been an extraordinary effort to try and bring all this together. And it's going to be something pretty unique. I don't think there's been anything like it in the city for 500 years. There was this great tradition of open-air entertainment in the city going back to pre-Reformation days. And interestingly, Henry VIII at the Reformation, he saw this sort of vibrant tradition. It was a Catholic tradition, of course, because it was around the London saints and so forth. So he shut it down. And obviously, the cult of Becket was virtually erased. Literally, you find manuscripts with his name scribbled out. So they were quite ruthless in really erasing Becket's London history. St. Thomas's Hospital was named after St. Thomas, and they switched it to Thomas the Apostle because after the Reformation, Becket wasn't the flavour of the month. That tradition of open air celebration, you still have it with the Lord Mayor's show, but it's very specific, and it's also in the middle of winter, which makes it a bit of a challenge. It can be quite cold watching it. We do have people who work in the city, and we do have people who live in the city, and lots of people contributing in all sorts of ways. The story of Becket would have been well known to an audience in 1519. It's not so well known to a modern audience. So there's a lot of good history in there. It's very much a family show. There's a bloody murder at the heart of it. But
you surprise me, James.
But there's a lot of fun in it. There's some great songs, which we hope people are going to walk away humming and singing this. They're building a 600-seat amphitheatre in Guildhall Yard, incidentally, right over the Roman amphitheatre. So there's a nice link there. Over probably the first formal entertainment space in the country. There's a 600-seat theatre that they're building for the 2 days for the performance. But around that, because of Becket's links to the city trades, who we think his father was a merchant, Becket himself was quite key in the early guild movement. His signature is on the first of all the guild charters, which was the Weavers' Charter in 1260, I think, possibly 1263. It's got Becket's name on it, and this is the first charter of the first guild that we know of, which is really exciting. So to reflect that, there's going to be a craft fair, which will be free entry. 18 livery companies are going to be showcasing various of their crafts, some ancient, some modern. And of course, the livery companies they've come a long way since the Middle Ages. And some of them still do what they did before. The cutlers will be there, still doing cutling, and the masons. But of course, some of the others have moved on. So the horners, who used to make horn cups, are now very focused on plastics. The fan makers, they now work with jet engines. The livery companies are very proud of their heritage, but they've also moved on. So there's going to be a craft fair around the show. So, you can wander into that at any time and learn a little bit about the specific history of the livery companies of London as well. So, it's nice to have that educational aspect to it. And another piece of that is that the livery movement was central to the growth of apprenticeships. And of course, that's very much a modern concept. So there will be a bit of a display about modern apprenticeship and what the city is doing for the modern apprentice movement. So a lot of different themes into this one event over 2 days. There's lots of education, but lots of entertainment. There's even a specially brewed Becket beer, which will be available to buy on the day.
Excellent. There you go. It's sold already. So for those listening across the globe and they're thinking, James, Hazel, who is this Thomas Becket you're talking about? Please do share a little bit about who he was and why he is important to London.
The historical Thomas Becket was the son of a Norman couple, Gilbert and Matilda, who probably came to London around the turn of the 11th, 12th century. Gilbert was a merchant. He became sheriff, and he was quite a sort of significant figure in London. Becket was born in 1120 in Cheapside. He probably went to school at one of the London grammar schools, went to Merton Priory, and then got a job working for a chap called Widenier, meaning 8 pence. So he was working for an accountant, we think. He then, after a spell in Paris, he was spotted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald, and became an archdeacon working in Theobald's office, and did quite a lot of diplomacy, I think, on behalf of the church. And this was around the 1140s, 1150s, the end of Henry I's reign, the anarchy, King Stephen and the Empress Matilda. He was a man of great skill, obviously, but very much a self-made man. Working for Theobald of Canterbury, he was spotted, or possibly Theobald suggested to Henry that Thomas might be quite a useful man to have alongside. And so he was recruited by Henry to become Chancellor. So he then moved from Canterbury to London as Henry II's Chancellor after Henry's coronation, and became a pretty key figure in the re-establishment of royal authority after the English Civil War and the anarchy of the 1140s and 50s. And when Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, died, it looked like a great opportunity to combine Henry II's desire to reform the English administration with getting more control over the English church. So he appointed Thomas as Archbishop of Canterbury at the same time as being Chancellor. And the idea was that this would re-establish royal authority over the church. So Thomas, wore both hats for a few years, until the point at which there were a series of disputes over jurisdiction. At what point did church jurisdiction finish and royal jurisdiction end, or vice versa? And there was a notorious issue of what's called the Criminous Clerks, that the clergy were protected by church law, and therefore they were safe from the king's law. And there was a case of a clergyman who had murdered someone, and the church punished him with, I think he was banished and had to say a few Hail Marys, but yeah, that was it. So this became quite a sort of cause célèbre between the church and the state. And as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas came down for the church. And the historical Thomas is quite difficult to read. What was it that made this man, who was, by all accounts, a very successful administrator and quite wealthy, what made him become this very ascetic churchman? And there's almost nothing in the historical record to give you much of a sense of what happened and why, other than a genuine conversion. And perhaps converts are often the most radical. He then started throwing a bit of weight around, excommunicating people left, right, and centre. So he excommunicated the Bishop of London, who was always his rival, because the Bishop of London thought that London should be the archbishopric, not Canterbury. And so Thomas left England I think in about 1165, and spent 5 years abroad, possibly hiding from Henry. It's not entirely clear why he was away for so long. And he came back in 1170. There was the possibility of a reconciliation with the king, but it didn't happen. And Henry famously uttered his phrase, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The four knights thought they understood his meaning. Off they went to Canterbury, and so the rest is history. Even for the Middle Ages, it was a scandalous event. They pushed their way into the cathedral and murdered him, on the steps of the chancel. There's a lot of historical record of the martyrdom, because he became the most popular saint of the Middle Ages. There are many saints' lives written about him. Many of the people around him were very scholarly. So there was John of Salisbury, William Fitzstephen, and these were all well-educated clerks. Fitzstephen wrote a really interesting life of Becket, the first few pages of which are the most wonderful description of London in 1170. So you almost one of the most valuable legacies of Thomas for London is this description of London written by his hagiographer. If you don't know it, it's worth finding a copy and reading it. Straight after his death, the miracles seemed to occur. So people gathered up his brains, they gathered up his blood, they hid his body from the knights, and miracles started happening. And within, I think, 3 years, in record time, he was canonized by the Pope and became probably the most famous European saint of the Middle Ages. Henry II admitted defeat and made penance he went to Canterbury and he crawled on his knees, bare-kneed, up to the altar at Canterbury to apologize. So this was a great victory. And as a historical figure, you say, what was Becket doing? He was playing a power game, and it was a power game that required him to pay the highest cost, but it was a gamble that paid off. And the church became extremely powerful. It set back many of the reforms that Henry II wanted to achieve in late 12th century England. And looking at it from a 21st century perspective, what Henry was doing was really quite reasonable. And, Becket was setting back modernization by centuries. Looked at from the Middle Ages, Becket was protecting the church. That's a historic figure. And then for London, so he became the patron saint of London. There's a wonderful seal in the Museum of London, which shows it's got St. Paul on one side and Becket on the other side, with Londoners underneath him, and then the city either side, the spires of the churches, with the logo Becket Protect Us, which he did for many years. London was always at odds with royal authority. They had a particular place in the English politics. And I think they saw someone who stood up to royal authority as someone who Londoners could identify with. And so there's that spirit of defiance, which, again, there's a spirit of defiance against COVID. London is bouncing back. London is not going to be a dead city. It's a living city, and it's going to celebrate the fact that we're now open for business. So just going back to Thomas, there were various hospitals which were founded in his name. So the site of his birthplace became the Hospital of the Knights of St. Thomas Dacon, and then was sold to the Mercers at the Reformation. So it's now Mercers Hall in Cheapside. I mentioned St. Thomas's Hospital south of the river. He had a shrine on London Bridge, which of course was the starting point for many pilgrims. And so the wealth of that pilgrimage trade contributed hugely to the wealth of London and the funding of London Bridge. There's a medieval book called the Liber Albus, which describes the sort of civic ceremonies of London in about 1400. And Becket is at the heart of all those. So the Lord Mayor processes up to, from Becket's birthplace up to St. Paul's, where his father is buried in the Pardon churchyard. And there was a wonderful chapel. It's gone now, of course, with the fire, with a great dance of death on the walls. They then process back, and the great conduit at Cheapside runs with red wine to signify perhaps the blood of Thomas. He is a central part of the civic ceremonial of London right up until 1532. And what's nice about the pageant is that the 1519 pageant is right at the end of that period. So it shows it's still very much alive, that worship of this great, powerful medieval saint.
Why do you think Henry VIII wanted to get rid of Thomas in particular? Because as you mentioned, there are books where there are just great big red stains raising any mention of Thomas Becket whatsoever. He seemed to be resolute of really targeting Thomas,
yes,
in particular.
I think it was a couple of things. Thomas represented someone who defied royal authority. He stood up to the first, or the second Henry. And so I think not only was he a symbol of all that Henry VIII didn't like about the Catholic faith, that he was also a symbol of defiance against the king. And actually, if you look at London ceremonials, Henry stepped in to take control of these London festivals. He made London put on a massive pageant for the coronation of Anne Boleyn, and so basically bankrupted the city and taxed the city so heavily that they couldn't afford to put pageants on afterwards. He was putting the squeeze on London, certainly. And I think Becket was both a symbol of defiance and a symbol of the old religion, which had to go. And heads were knocked off statues, names scrubbed out of books. And link between Becket and London has been virtually lost, which is a shame, among other things, as well as telling everyone that the city is open for business, as well as bringing open air theatre back into the city. There's a little bit of history that's coming back as well. So that's going to be
Brilliant.
Good.
Fantastic. We've covered the man, we've covered the myth, we've covered London from 1519, and also we have covered London coming back full on caffeine for the modern day pageant. Tickets are available online, James?
Yes, they are. Yes. It's on there are performances over 2 days. At the end of it, there's going to be a parade which nods to the original pageant parade with giants.